All right, welcome back to another episode of We Don't Know What This Is. Today we're going to be talking about some of the political atmosphere that we're going through. We're not going to go into the specifics of the politics or trying to avoid, our own personal preferences, I guess you could call it, towards any of the candidates. But we are going to talk through how this election has left the country as well as the world in some cases uh, feeling like it's very unique, as Sarnbo has put it here. We realize that the political atmosphere is different this year, and it's because we haven't been able to jump into one of these episodes in a while now. We wanted to jump in and talk about it and kind of use that as a foray to get back into recording these more regularly. So I'm Sean, as you all know.
It's me. I'm your boy. It's your guy. It's your dude, Sarmbo, the real one and only here. Welcome back. It's so good to see you again, Sean. I really do mean that. The mustache is looking very, very good. I can't stop saying that. You can own that. But yeah, well said, well stated. I think that the individual opinion of what we may have is one thing, and we can have that conversation. But I actually think it's more unique and more important maybe in some cases is to kind of understand like what's happening as a result, why things feel so different, and why like the typical election cycle. So there's some things we're going to talk about, and I'm excited to talk about them. Long time no see, a little bit of fun and excitement going on. So yeah, I mean we'll just kind of jump into it, and I'll ask the first question. I mean, there's no Voldemorts here or whatever. We could say it. The upcoming election is, what is it? Voting days in a couple days officially. It's on Tuesday. It's the third Sunday right now. So things are heating up as far as the pressure is concerned. We know that it's a strong race, an even race for the most part, from what I can see, at least for the popular vote is concerned, between um, candidate Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. So there's a lot of crazy stuff I think that's happening, but it's causing a lot of discourse. And I guess the real question is, why do you think that things feel so divisive now? Why do you think things feel so polarized, or even maybe like we exist in a bit of an echo chamber? I personally think that I've seen that. I've been apolitical for the large majority of my life, thinking, hey, those are some people doing political things. I know that it affects me, but it doesn't feel like, I got no dogs in this. And I never felt like it was important enough for me to become politically active, for me to become politically involved. But I felt that with this particular candidacy more than ever. And I think I've been more informed now this candidacy than before. I don't know if that's because I'm getting old, or but I do actually believe it's because of the candidates themselves, political environment, and what's happening. So what do you think that things are so different? Things are so divisive now.
I think that you're definitely right that a lot of things are feeling it's just it feels really like over the last several elections it's been just
Mm-hmm.
increasingly more and more divided. So it's one of those situations we haven't really had an opportunity to uh, come back together as I guess the polarizing aspect of it is the two sides, Republicans versus Democrats, and it's
Mm-hmm.
not left a lot of space for us to build back together as a stronger, I guess, as a more unified country. And I think that that's a lot to do with the discourse between the parties and the what you might call the additional distancing between uh, the two sides, that makes them more polarizing at this point. So a lot of the viewpoints that are coming from the left or the right, they're getting increasingly further and further apart, where it's getting a lot more
Mm-hmm.
difficult to come back to find that middle ground between them. And there's some issues that we start to swing, like some of the issues that will swing further right normally are starting to swing back to the left a little bit, and some of the issues that swing further to the left are starting to swing back towards the right a little bit. And that's what
Mm-hmm.
we're starting to see with a lot of these I get the independent candidates are starting to recognize that and start to talk about those issues, even though we're still kind of focusing on that two-party system, uh, which has caused a lot of, like I'm saying, is causing a lot of strife between the groups. And I think another part of it is that we're just becoming a lot the communication in society is increasing, hundreds of folds, like every election cycle, it seems. Because
Hmm.
I remember the last election cycle was the best internet I could have at the time, or maybe it was two election cycles ago. The best internet you could get really as a consumer, for commercial use or individual use, residential use, would be around 100 megabytes a second, and now we're up to a gig, and in some cases 10 gigs in some areas, which is communication is speeding up, and a lot more people exist nowadays. And while the population is not really increasing at this point, the people that it has been increasing with over these last 10 15 a couple of decades at least, they're getting into jobs where media and communication is a lot more important. So this
Hmm.
time around, we have a lot of influencers, which you can't. I wouldn't call them necessarily reporters or news sources necessarily,
Like
but they talk
pundits. Yeah.
exactly. But it's kind of like you can become a pundit at this point, just on your own, as opposed to uh, getting on some major network. And so that's another way that communication has kind of improved the ability of people to pass information, whether it be true or fake, or false rather.
No, dude, I'm on board with a lot of what you're saying. I do think too, maybe we need to take a step back to a little to maybe kind of explain maybe some of the basics of it. Because when you're talking about extreme left positions and extreme right positions, and then becoming more centric, either more liberal or more conservative, I think it may help to kind of talk about what that might mean or what some of those stances are. But to your other points, I think you're so right. That communication is increasing due to technology, accessibility. People have more access to these things, and actually more interesting too. Not comparatively, but just over time, more and more over time. That I think is interesting is that people are not turning to mainstream news sources for their for the news, political news. They are going to these influencer spaces. They're wanting to watch YouTube videos. They're wanting to watch Twitch streamers. They're wanting to watch people maybe who's a bit more relatable or have a bit more accessibility in that. Because there is this distrust of these large systems that, to be honest, are prioritizing making money through views, and they no longer have a responsibility to report the other side. What was that, like in 1990 that they stopped having to do that? Before
Right.
they had to say what the other argument was. You have to look at both. Now they don't have to do that anymore. So it's like,
Right.
oh, is this a corporate thing? Are we not? Are these people getting bought out? Like you watch Fox News, specifically Fox News, you're only going to get a conservative viewpoint. Like are you watching CNN, et cetera, et cetera. So now people now more days are looking to YouTube for that. They are looking for Twitch for that. And the problem I think with that too is that like I think you kind of touched on this a little bit. It's like these guys are just people sitting in their rooms experiencing things. Not all of them are reading the source material. Not all of them are looking at policies. Not all of them are, you know, going and drawing off reputable sources for statistics and data, but they're talking about it so matter of factly. The journalistic integrity that most of these news sources had to come with is non-existent for these individual influencer pundits, and they don't take that responsibility. What happens when these people are wrong? For example, almost nothing. I think that a couple of names that come up when we talk about this, I think you can't avoid mentioning Hassan Piker and the whole situation. We were talking about this, and I know specifically when he was making some comments about things that were happening in Israel Palestine, he's reading news stories as they're breaking, giving his opinion as if things are very matter of fact, and it's come back that factually he was incorrect. And usually your journalistic integrity calls you to come back and say, okay, look, this thing that I said last week when I made this when I made this was wrong. I was wrong in that. I'm here to correct the record. But now these people don't have to do that. Doesn't have to do that. They don't. They're not put to that standard, and people still watch them. People still do that, and I think that it's in line with a bit more of how the news cycle is also going too, where people are going to watch stream opinions. They want the discourse. They want that quick. They want that catchy. They want the yelling. They want the passion. They want the
Mm.
fervor, and they are believing these things. And of course, I don't expect. I mean, maybe this is bad that I think that, but I don't think that the average person wants to read about really about the ground coverage on the news. I don't think people want to read court indictments. I don't think people want to read. This is boring stuff for a lot of people. But
Right.
even though it's super, super important, they're not reading the policies. They're not even understanding the issues. They're letting these people stand in front of them, and you trust your pundits because the journalistic system is supposed to reinforce these guys as factual representation of the truth. But
Right.
now, I mean, what is it? Maybe you do know this. I forget. There's a news network that shows you, like a source that shows you all the news networks and their affiliation. And then you can look at a news story that's reported on the left, and then you can see the same story reported on the right. And you can see how the headline changes. You can see how the information is changing. And you can find ones that are biased or unbiased. And I think that's a really important resource to have. But I don't think a lot of people are interested in that. That's not the case. So
Yeah.
I'm reinforcing a lot of what you're saying. And it's like, where is the middle ground? Where is the centric opinion? Where is that? And honestly, I think it's still there. I just think it's boring as fuck. I just think it's so boring. Um, the middle opinion is it's not sexy. It's not hot. It's not gonna grab people's attentions. I think to have people say, well, let's meet down the middle and let's discard these dumb device not dumb. Okay, I don't want to put a valence on. Let's discard these divisive issues and talk about what really needs. I've always been in the idea of if we ignore some of these extreme opinions, not or the ones that we're so holded rudely onto, we can have better conversations about some things that we fix and that we can change. Just to give you some examples, it's like gun control versus abortion. It's like I get these things are important to each side, but why are we having such a strong? Let's not die on this hill. Let's acquiesce that hey, okay, people want to have guns. Hey, people want to do this, and let's talk about some of the other stuff in the middle. What are we doing, and how can we make that happen? Um,
Right.
I, I have some opinions as to like why that that may be happening. There's um, a lot of things that are rooted. They're deep rooted into the human brain due to like just evolution of wanting to feel like you're a part of a group, like-minded opinions, wanting to be involved and have the right opinion, and then now social media and algorithms feeding you material that agrees with your point already. So people are not getting exposed to the opposite opinion, and now it's not. This is somebody who's my brother that we don't agree about. This is somebody who doesn't agree with me. They're the enemy, and I'm not listening to what this person has to say. I'm going to say what I need to say, and I'm going to believe what is
Hmm.
being reinforced by me. And we're not challenging. We're not having, and that's kind of heartbreaking to me because I think that the point of having the freedom to talk about these things is that people should want to not should want to, but we need to listen to what the other people are saying. We can't just cast them out because they don't agree with us. I went drinking the other day. I met up with some work people so we could discuss it. And we had drinks, but somebody came up to us, um, and she had a lot to drink. But she wanted to know who everybody was voting for. And we were just like, we're not really trying to have this conversation. We're just here to have some drinks and talk about some stuff. Like, who are you
Right.
voting? Are you voting for this person? Are you voting for that person? And there was one guy that was like, yeah, dude, I'm voting for this person. It's like, you're a terrible person. I hope your balls fall off. And I hope that you never have kids. And I'm like, dude, what you don't even know him. You don't know why he believes that that's the case and you're wishing bad things on him. Like even if I had the same opinion as you, I wouldn't want to
Right.
associate with you cuz we're not meeting in the middle. We're not understanding. We're not and the crazy part about it is before this came up, he was very helpful. She asked about where he got his watch. He's like, "Oh, this place is down the street, but you don't have to go here. You can go to this other place." He knew the area and he wanted to help her. And she was listening. And the second she knew what his political opinion was, that's
Hmm.
it. You're the enemy. I hope your balls fall off. I hope they chop your dick off and throw it in a blender. And I hope you have to get forced to drink it. Like it's crazy
Yeah.
how fast it just snaps. But that I think it's a result of this happening. To be completely honest with you, unfortunately, yeah.
Right. Yeah, and that I feel like that's becoming a lot more common nowadays, not in, and obviously not in a good way. One of the biggest issues that I've seen is that I say a biggest issue. One of the big issues is that a lot of people aren't comfortable having those conversations anymore because everything is so polarized, and
Hmm.
it's very difficult to recover from that. And something that also, kind of concerned me with even this conversation is, where does it go? And if there is a difference of opinion, not saying that it's going to be between you and I, but even if somebody that we know starts seeing what we talk about here and they're like, no, you have to choose a side, you have to choose a hill to die on. It's like, well, no, that's not what we're doing here. We're just here to have a conversation about some of the things that we've seen and some of some of the struggles that we've experienced ourselves, even between ourselves and friends or family, whatever it ends up
Hmm.
being. And I know that that's become an issue, even in like a previous relationship of mine. Like it wasn't something that kind of threw everything off, but you could tell that something was different between me and the other person because of a conversation that we have, that we just have differences of opinion, and we saw something or we experienced something, the same situation, but we viewed it from different perspectives, and saw, and it affected our judgment on how, or I guess how we judge what happened,
Yeah.
differently. And I think that that is a really complicated problem that a lot of people are dealing with nowadays. They can't really push past the perspective of politics and how, I I think it's because politics has become a lot more important in our lives. And you even said it at the beginning. I meant to talk about it before, but whenever we were, back in high school, like it was, politics was something that was there, and people were talking about it because it was coming up on election time. It's like, oh, who would you vote for? Who are you going to vote for? It's like, now since you'll actually be old enough to vote at the time, it's like, well, I'm not, I don't care all that much at the time. Like I cared a little bit because I understood of some of the things that were happening, but we were
Hmm.
more focused on, what's going on, or what's going to be on the test the next day, or what are we, how early we have to wake up for marching band practice. Like
Right,
this
right.
really depends on, it wasn't something that was hugely important to us. And I recognized even getting into college that a lot more people were starting to become a little more focused on it, a little more interested in politics. But even still, there, everybody's just like, okay, who are we playing this week in, in football, or who, what do we expect for the season, or is there, am I going to, pass the semester, stuff like that. Um, I did notice that in the past few years, I did start getting a lot more interested. And uh, to your point, like I actually started going back and reading some of those documents, some of the source documents of what people were talking about. And I think that's another issue with entertainment nowadays, because that's what a lot of the pundits are talking. That's the reason for existing, is to provide that level of entertainment. And because,
Hmm.
just like you said, talking politics or talking, policy isn't sexy, right? It's one of those situations where you want to try and present the information in the best way possible and convince people that you're correct, because that's what a lot of the entertainment at this point is. It's a, or on a, arguably at this point, I would call, pundits. They're just there to try and convince you of one side or the other, not necessarily entertain, but they know that they are more successful if they entertain you at the same time. So with a lot of these discussions, or a lot of these entertainment folks, and a lot of people are starting to trust the entertainers or the
Hmm.
pundits or on Twitch that are presenting the news, because Twitch has provided them a platform where they could do that. And in some cases, I think some of them are effective at it, because they always go back to the original article that they're talking about. But whenever you talk to even some of the mainstream news sources nowadays, they don't really talk about where they got that information. They're just like, oh, it's firsthand knowledge. You trust us. Like we are the newscasters. We know what we're talking about, and it gets a lot more difficult for them to believe what they're saying whenever that's all they're providing. Um, with a lot of these entertainers, it's the same situation, but in their way, they're more entertaining. And exactly as you said, they're a lot more relatable, because they're not sitting on camera in a fancy suit saying what their opinions are, and they don't have this preconceived notion that they are leaning a certain way, left or right, right? So
Hmm.
I think that's another issue that we're running into, that makes it a little more difficult to differentiate between them. And just like you said, though, a lot of my news sources, because well, the nature of my job is to look at multiple sources. So I'm looking at the Fox stories, I'm looking at the CNN stories, the MSNBC,
Mm-hmm.
the ABC. I'm looking at all those, and I'm going and looking at other countries and seeing what they're saying. And they're saying something
Yeah.
completely different in a lot of cases. So for that, you're talking BBC, Al Jazeera, all these other big name companies overseas, right? Uh,
Mm-hmm.
Even sometimes RT, which is Russian Times, but they have a pretty big presence in America even. So some people
Right.
do listen to them. But I'm also looking at some of these vodcasters or podcasters and what they're talking about, because there's a few that I listen to that actually go back and read the original article, and they'll say, hey, this is the way I understand it. If you dig back into the actual details of the article, or the policy that was written by the government, or the judgment, or whatever it ends up being, they actually talk to and read word for word. This is what that is. So yeah, it does align with the story, or it does align with the story, but it looks like it was kind of one part of the issue was inflated a little bit for the sake of gaining more views, right? So
Right. Damn. Yeah. I'm totally on board with you there. I like some of the things that you were saying specifically about like politics becoming more and more important in our lives, and I think this is happening at the same time as politics reaching a younger generation, and we're also getting older, right? And so I think we're in a really strange and interesting phenomenon where we're kind of like being rapidly thrust into the political sphere as a result of that transition happening, like us specifically. And I know the nature of your work is kind of also probably even further thrusting you into that. But I agree with that. And one of the things that I was thinking about when you said that was about how, like, before, and I think in the previous, even as early as the last election, politicians don't even try to win a younger vote because they know that young people don't vote. They know that the general voting body was always in the Middle Ages. You're looking from 40 and up. These people are the ones that are primarily voting. But
or
now you're seeing, yeah. Oh,
yeah,
good.
sorry, or they just they have a preconceived notion. They know this is who they're going to vote for, and they're not going to change their mind regardless of what you say. So
Correct. And that's a huge part of the increasing political discourse that cements people into a line of thinking. Because at that point, your political affiliation is no longer something that's tied to the things that you believe, which may be nebulous and non concrete or willing to change. It's a part of your identity as a person. Such that if the core values of the political party you're affiliated with change, you also go with them because you don't know how to deal with the dissonance associated with the fact that you've got to change what you think about and how you feel. And you've seen this happen a lot where a lot of people, specifically a lot of Democrat talking points by very early on, have switched to Republican points now. And people have either stayed with that or not even realizing that I've always been a Democrat. That's why I vote Democrat. My family's voted blue. I tell my kids to vote blue, or vice versa.
hmm
I'm not saying one way or another, but 100% you're definitely on point. And two, now look, you can see the evidence in the political campaign today because I think unprecedentedly, you see President-elect Trump on podcasts now with like Aiden Ross, and like this was insane to me. But nothing that's happening that they're doing politically, this is not unintentional. He doesn't like, oh, I think the podcast is really cool. Maybe he does think it's really cool. I don't know, but he wouldn't spend his time and effort in his political campaign on these spaces if he didn't know that there was an audience there to win or to
right.
talk about. And people now, or younger people, are taking an interest in politics, especially young men, because they're feeling like the political system, in addition to the world around them, has forsaken them.
hmm
And I think that um, you see more and more people getting involved in politics as well, because a lot of the spaces, like, people really want to belong to something. They
hmm
want to be a part of something. They want that. It's a part of community and identity. This is a natural human need. And you see places where this was very common, like with school, fraternities, church, for example, church communities, religion. These are now less and less. The younger people and the younger generations are less and less involved in these. So they want to be a part of something, and politics is now something to be a part of. You can now have a space where your voice and your opinion is being resonated with like-minded people who are in the same space as you are. Politics is taking some of those people in, and these guys know it. That's why you see Kamala Harris on, I forget the podcast. It was like Unprecedented. She,
Oh,
it's like a female
it's
driven. Do you know what I'm talking about?
yeah, it's called the Call Me Daddy podcast.
Okay,
Yeah.
yes, you're that's the one. Where Kamala Harris from the Call Me Daddy podcast. What you've got, like I mentioned, Trump was with Aiden Ross, and there was XQC that showed up there. It's like, what is going on? And then now he's on the Joe Rogan Experience, and so is JD Vance. It's like
Yeah.
the podcast space. We know what the target graphic is. Well, it's younger audiences, and they're trying to win those young votes for people that want to belong to political space.
And
I don't
it's
necessarily disagree with that idea, but you're seeing it change, and these are all cementing what we're experiencing, and why I agree with you. Without those other third spaces, do it.
So, for the sake of
But
asking about it, do you think that
yeah,
COVID had a huge part to play in that? Because I feel that whenever COVID came around and everybody started getting kind of forced home to stay out of those groups where they used to gather more commonly, so whether that be church, whether that be like a pickleball club or something like that, they don't have those opportunities to go out. So they found those communities online, and now everybody's staying home with those new communities. And while because we have like kind of a distinct, I wouldn't say advantage necessarily, but we have a kind of a long running ability to or experience in having those online communities. Uh,
mhm.
I don't think that it impacted us as much as it did impact the rest of society, which was so used to going to like again going to a physical place of gathering where they spent time with each other and were able to have those that discourse in person. Whereas nowadays they're starting to adjust, and while we grew up in these I say online communities, we were able to build like a level of rapport with each other or a level of trust with each other, or I would almost call it like we were able to understand and build manners online, whereas a lot of these people they're going online and just throwing out information now to each other in these online communities, and they don't care what people think about them because there's whether it's because of the anonymity or the fact that they're not face to face with a person, they don't have the same level of uh, you know. I guess they have a little more carelessness when it comes to how they interact with other people and talk through some of these political points, which kind of goes back to your story that you shared at the beginning when you guys went out to the bar.
Yes. Okay. I want to respond to this because I think you made that's a very, very good question. But before I do that, I kind of want to touch on one of the other things that you'd
Yeah.
said before about, about these sources not having to cite back, the pundits not necessarily, or the news stories not really citing back to the sources.
Hmm.
Some of these pundits are doing that. I do think that you're seeing that happen. And for all the reasons that you said before, that we know that we already agree with about politics not being like a very sellable, sexy thing, but
Right.
it's like one of the examples that came to my mind when you were talking about that was how what was it, the vice president debate where they were talking about Haitians eating cats, um, and Ohio.
Hmm.
I remember that happening, and I thought that was absolutely insane that they ran with that from an eyewitness testimony that was unfounded in any capacity. It's like, how is that even remotely possible? And why aren't these guys getting reamed for the amount of dishonesty that's being presented from the fact that they're saying things because they saw it on the news, because they heard it, because we didn't want to check to make sure that they're actually happening or not. And it makes it really hard to want to trust and believe some of these sources when they're running away from things like that all the way to the front. Trump was saying these things, and JD Vance was saying, and I found it to be incredulous watching that happen. We we have no reports. People aren't saying that's the. How did this happen? How did anybody let them run away with the story? There's a whole team of these people, and I think that something I heard recently is pretty true in this case. That Republicans don't have any policies, and Democrats don't have a spine. That they can go up there, Republicans can go up and say things that are just factually unfounded, and Democrats will just allow them to get away with it essentially by, well, there's a middle ground, and maybe there's another perspective, and let's hear them out. When it's like, this is this is incredibly, incredibly bad faith. And why would we let this happen? Why aren't we doing something about this? And I think you kind of see that. Like there's this accolade. It's like we're going to try to compare apples to oranges and say, well, we're talking about fruit the whole time. We're not talking about fruit. We're talking about apples. We're talking about apples. Like, what's happening here? But yeah, I think that you are seeing some people responsibly being great pundits in that influencer space. There are a couple people that come to my mind that are reading the indictments. They're quoting things verbatim. They're looking at their sources. There are some people that are joking about some of them, like, oh, he gets all of his information from Wikipedia. Well, it's okay. At least he's getting his information from somewhere. And these sources within Wikipedia are actually valid sources. So don't discredit it. Don't argue that in bad faith. Are you doing this? Are you even trying to? Where's your information? Are you educating yourself? So it's like I get that, and it's a reflection of what the personal space is representing versus what people believe these news sources to be representing. They think that that's the case. And to one of your other points about relatability is that it's hard for like one individual person who's an influencer for you to say that this person's being paid out. Like this person is not representative of some big government conspiracy type like gerrymandering. There's not a bunch of people paying these guys off the way that you maybe would see that happen on a corporate level. That's a whole corporate and governmental distrust. So that's why some people maybe are more inclined to listen to or to believe that source than they would something that's a bit more online. I think a little bit anecdotal. I heard about this very recently that, and that's been a long time since I played League or watched League. But like that League official Riot officially streams like their LCS stuff, right? But
Right.
there are some people in the community. I think one of the Eric is something. I don't know these people anymore because I don't keep up with it.
Hmm.
But it's the guy in his room giving like his own reactions, and there's tens of thousands of people watching that,
Right.
and it's like Riot has done a really smart thing by supporting that because they know that's where their people are. It's like, oh, we're going to give resources to this person because this is where people are wanting to get this stuff from.
Right.
And then they brought in something that was tied to it about football. There's like there's like a Peyton Manning experience or whatever, where it's like Peyton and Eli watching the game and giving like peanut gallery commentary on what happened, as opposed to watching the NFL package or watching it on cable or something like that.
Right.
So it's like people want these like more intimate looking spaces. And you're seeing that happen. There's a couple more examples, but I don't want to get too far in but I'm saying all that to say that I agree, and you're seeing that happen, and probably to get some texture as to why we may be seeing that happen. But to answer your question about COVID and the part that it had to play with the distancing that we're experiencing, I think that it definitely did. I think that it did. COVID. I'm sorry. I think COVID had a very, very big role to play in how people interact fundamentally, in so many different ways. Some of them are easy to understand, and some of them are not so hard or not so easy to see. They're very difficult
Hmm.
here, right? Um, and it's also and it's important to recognize it disproportionately affects men and women. Women, I mean, to just highlight our differences, not saying one's worse than the other. Okay, disclaimer. But anyway, women are very social creatures. They're more social creatures than men are. And maybe creatures isn't the right word, but uh, just follow the logic, right? Women value interpersonal relationships a lot more than men do, and COVID really screwed that up for women. Can't go out and see the people that they want to. They can't form those relationships like they used to. There was like a study or a report that was done, and don't ask me to cite this. Can't. I am talking off the cuff here, where they looked at the impact that COVID had on people who are experiencing that generation, and they anticipate that it took 4 years off the life of the young women who experienced it, as opposed to 1 to 2 years for men, because of how badly it disrupts social spaces and environments. You can't go to bars. Going to school is different. Some people couldn't go to work. And these are all places where people are experiencing social interaction in a way that is fundamental to their development and those social skills. To go with what you were saying earlier as well, we grew up in an online space. We were definitely logged into space. We had community in the sense that we, through school and all that. But we also had responsibility within that online space that made it so that we had to care about how we were presenting ourselves in those spaces. I can just go around being an asshat in my anonymity to the people in my guild because I needed to work with these people. I needed to I need to respect them and we needed to get along and we need to get together. There were consequences despite my anonymity for how I presented myself online, and that gave us sort of etiquette. The way that many other people are dealing with or interfacing with online spaces with anonymity is that they're free of consequence. It's the consequence part of it that makes it the structure exist. If I can go and act however it is that I want to act on an online space, I just blast the N word because I want to be belligerent. I think it's edgy, funny humor. If I want to make fun of people because I think they're trans, I can do that. I can leave that social space and I can go somewhere else and do it all over. But
Right.
if I go and I do that at work, that's absolutely unacceptable. If I do that at my friend group or at school, I'm going to get chastised for that. I'm going to get ostracized for that. There's shame, and shame is so powerful. Shame is such a powerful modulator for people's experience that they will not want to. You don't get that on me. And I think that when we are forced more into online space, you're allowed to act in this way. People would never say the same things that they would say to people online in real life. But me and you, maybe, for example, and we could be outliers. If we met all the people that we were in guilds with online, we would largely be the same. We'd see the same people and the same interactions, and it would just be awkward as to whether or not to use our online names or our government target. That's like it. And that's been my experience when I've met these people, because these social spaces had consequences. It was shame, and you didn't want to be out of these. And that's what kind of makes you do that. Now, not so much. That's happening way more often. I think people they don't have the social skills they used to. And not having those social skills, I think, definitely does play a part, because you are only going to feel comfortable in spaces, or it's easier rather to feel comfortable in spaces where your opinion is already agreed upon and these people are saying the same things. I think it's way easier for you to do that. I think that as a consequence too, it's harder for you to understand other people because you don't have experience with conflict. Even in our case, where the conflict was very low stake, these people, I'm thinking more about Gen Z, are now entering in the workforce. Gen Alpha, these guys are now entering in the workforce, and they don't know how to act under periods of stress when they react to other people. They're not having a sense of professionalism, and it seems like they really just don't want to show up for this kind of stuff. The way that we've built structure of the workplace doesn't work for these people in the same way, because they're not used to dealing with that adversity when it comes to a low stakes environment. One more point, I'll turn over because I'm curious what you think about this specifically. Is that there is a book that's written, and I forget the author now, and I have to cite it, called like The Anxious Generation, and he talks about how children don't socialize the way that they used to before. He talks specifically about this low stakes um, um, social interaction that happens, like when you're kids. Maybe you've had this experience. Maybe this is going to date a lot of people that are listening to this. But I went outside and I played with other kids when I was growing up. I got locked outside, so I had to do that. And I didn't mind doing it. It was fun. It was hot, whatever. But you get in these spaces where you meet with a bunch of kids and you guys take turns making rules and enforcing those. You get to play in low stakes environment where you're the judge, where you're the participant. In some cases, you're the executioner, right? Like you're enacting consequence for that judgment. And that is so fundamental for us because those skills carry over into high stakes environment where your decisions may determine whether or not somebody loses their job or whether or not somebody loses their life in some cases if you go into medical fields. But now that people have a distrust, and there's a myriad of reasons. I think it's a fascinating book. Some of the things that I've talked about here are from that. But now that you're having these people come up without that experience, they're very inept, and I think we're seeing that. The same disconnect that's keeping us away politically is also we're not understanding each other as genders. Even people are afraid to approach women because women are terrifying to some men, for example, and maybe even vice versa. You've heard some of the things that women think about men when they're not listening to each other. That men are these scary predator type people. Oh, what is it like? Would you rather leave your daughter in a forest with a bear or with a man? Or you've heard that. That's like that is analogous to the general consensus of how dangerous people think the average stranger male is, and it's shockingly high. Some people to hear that, and maybe to some women it isn't shockingly high because they're like, I feel the same way. I feel the same way. But yeah, that's my your question.
Yeah. And I do agree that in some cases there is like, oh, I say I think that it has become higher than it used to be, but I think that more so, I mean, a general society, I think you can relatively trust in the case of not having to, or not being particularly dangerous to each other. I do think that I do 100% agree that people are just having a harder time talking to each other nowadays.
Hmm.
We're struggling to have those conversations and meet each other, and I think that definitely has a part to play from COVID. But I think that it's a longer term issue that has just been growing over time as communication has increased. So I
Correct.
kind of I kind of harken a lot of these things back to communication being one of the key problems, and it's one of the limiting factors and one of the advancing factors for society. So we get to see and communicate a lot easier. It's easier to get information passed across the world in just a matter of mere seconds, as opposed to what it used to be, where you had to give it to a messenger and they had to ride a horse or walk it to
Yeah.
a state away or something like that to get that message, and it takes weeks in that case, as opposed to those seconds. But at the same time, we are starting to hear more often about these issues greater across the society, which a lot of it has to do with politics right now, obviously. So that's why we're
Mhm.
kind of having that conversation. But when it comes to discussing or having a fear of certain things, it's easier to pass that message. Say, hey, this happened to me today. This was a terrible thing that happened. When the reality is that some of these things were still happening way back when. It
Hmm.
just wasn't getting passed as quickly as it is now, to the point where the whole world can see it instantly, like live streamed, and then be able to react to it in real time, where there's just one perspective and there wasn't time to go back and vet what's been talked about or what actually
Correct.
happened. So kind of to your point, talking about Ohio, like yes, there's still there's definitely like misconstrued information there, and I think that it's still something that has to be kind of talked about, because I have heard more than that one source that you mentioned. One of the other sources I had heard personally on that note was talking about one of the police chiefs that's up there, as well as another person that had recorded a video of something happening. I haven't dug into it deeply because it's one of those things where I'm like, that's not one of my top priority issues for this election. I'm focusing more on
Yeah.
what the policies are of the individual candidates and how they're like, not necessarily. The struggle is finding out, like, they can have this policy, but can they complete that policy? That's two different things.
Correct.
So,
Yeah. Yeah.
and that's the difficulty in what I'm seeing, and a lot of it, you have to look at what they've done in the past, and it's hard to. Uh, there's a lot of newscasters nowadays and pundits and podcasters that are talking about all these individual actions that they have completed throughout their lives, and trying to either give validity to what they've said they've accomplished, or say, hey, they accomplished this kind of, but not exactly to the level of what they're kind of presenting to the public. And a lot of
Correct.
that we actually see within uh, I have to use my own anecdotal evidence for this, but we see that when it comes to our awards packages within the military, a lot of things that gets passed, like when we write up these awards packages, whether it be a quarterly award or an annual award or a monthly award or whatever it ends up being, we all talk about what we accomplished this year, but it's all quantified in a way that is true, but it makes it seem more inflated in what it actually was, because you're being compared to hundreds or thousands of other people in some cases. So it's
Right.
very difficult to capture that you are this star performer, you deserve more money, you deserve to be promoted, you deserve to be a leader, without presenting it in a way that everybody expects it to be given to them. And it's like, oh well, you did my own situation. I recently put up a package where I was told, hey, your package looks amazing. Like you look like you're definitely you are like our top contender for this, but because you're missing this thing, we're going to have to write a waiver for you to get around that issue.
Mm.
And because of that, because you have that waiver in your package, you're going to look worse than everybody else. And I'm like, okay, well, okay, whatever. But that's just to kind of give an example of like how everybody is how this is kind of been standardized across the industry, and like not just industry, but that's spreading to society as well at this point, is where everybody
Mhm.
is expecting something presented a certain way. And because of that, things get inflated, and it doesn't really capture what you truly accomplished, because not everybody is got our deities walking among man, right? It's not that simple. It's one of those situations where they just were able to capture what they accomplished in a way that everybody is like, well done, well done, you are man or woman of the year, right? uh, so I think that that's going to become a increasingly complicated issue as we move forward, because of the way that communication is, and how we continue to standardize those expectations across reality, and how everybody has to one up each other, and we have to keep climbing. Everything has to be progress, or you look worse than the previous generation, whereas their standards weren't as high, right? So, and I think
Mhm.
that also kind of leads, and that's what we're starting to run into with presidential candidates these last few cycles, is it, there's a level of miscommunication of the accomplishments, so that they seem above the last person.
The opponent,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Whereas the reality is, none of them were all that great. We're just trying to keep one upping, so we show that forward progression, and not only internally to the U.S. but globally, we portray a society that is continuing to advance and being number one, right?
Sure, yeah. And I think that what you're saying is true. And I think there's a lot of value and importance to how things actually look, because so much of what we do is not our ability to execute on it, but it's on our ability for people to believe that we can. Like, it's not necessarily about it actually being there, but the fear of it being present, or not necessarily fear, but like you have to know that there would be consequences. It's like, hey, America is a world power for a reason. You may be looking at these things that are happening, but it's like, don't step out of line. There will be some intervention. There will be consequences. You can't just go around and do terrible things without having to answer someone. But yes, like I think you made a really interesting point about like the speed of news increasing as things over time. It kind of ties to like, do you know why our election day is on Tuesday in the middle of the week?
I'm sure there's a myriad of reasons, but which one are you aiming for here?
Okay, so the one that I don't know how true this is or not, but the one that I've been told is because this is how long it took for somebody to attend church service on Sunday, and then for them to run the ballots into the town for them to be actuated and counted. So it's 2 days to allow for the mail to get through after Sunday service, and that's why it was on a Tuesday.
Interesting.
But yeah, that thought that was, maybe if that's true, that's interesting because it talks about how slow things used to be and how
Hmm.
fast things are now, and how sensationalized things are because they're fast, and how there's more pressure from the news to be the first person to report on something that happened. And when you're the first person to report on something, what are the chances that you have all the facts? What are the chances are you going to get it 100% right? What are the chances are you going to be having a take that's absolutely correct? There is a chance, and you take that chance every single time because you want to be the first person to report on it. And if you're going to be second, then you're going to be slightly more correct than this person is, or you don't want to be third, right? Like that race is there because you're losing views, you're losing
Yeah.
money, you're losing attention,
Yeah.
and
If you're
that's
not
that's
first,
where
you're
it is that they,
last.
yeah, you're not first, you're last. But it comes at the cost of accuracy. It comes at the cost of truth in some cases. And like I mentioned before, if we're not going by and we're not setting the record straight, then what do we do by being first? We poison the well of truth. That's something that's being misrepresented on things that are not happening in the soil. And I think that's one of the things that's really unique about this particular election. But that leads me into one of my next topic questions, which is like, we understand and we kind of know to some extent how politics have evolved. What you said before is very, very true. We're running the same game. It's not about like, it's always politicians being windbags, and saying all the things that they will do. But then you go back and you look at what actually was accomplished, and you actually see it. Yeah, it wasn't what they said, but actually, yeah, some things are good. This is reality ends up shaking up this way, right? But what is it? This election feels very, very unique. I think, and I know I haven't experienced a lot of election cycles in my lifetime, being 30, and my adult life specifically. Um, but there is something I think very, very, very unique about this. I think we talked about it before a little bit as to why things are feeling more divided. But Why do you think this election it's such a big hot button topic? I have my opinions, but I'm curious as to what you think. I'll let you take that.
Well, I mean, I still kind of jump back to the same kind of consideration as the number one being is that we're so polarized between the two different parties, and it's difficult for everybody to find that middle ground. And there's a few people that are just that's where we have the swing voters, the moderates, as you might call them. But a lot of people nowadays that would typically consider themselves a conservative or a liberal, they're starting to call themselves moderates because the two parties are starting to swing further left and right than what they have in the past, and they're starting to divide those issues up between them. When the reality is that nobody is truly what the liberals are today. Nobody is truly what the conservatives are today. A lot of people would be considered moderates because they have some views from the conservative side, they have some views from the liberal side, or they have a few more from the conservative side or a few more from the liberal side. But there's nobody that is just straight Republican, like across the ballot, everything that their policy dictates is what they agree with. That Likewise, there's no one that is a straight Democrat that they align
Mm-hmm.
completely with those policies. But everybody has chosen, everybody has in a sense regressed into this kind of tribal uh, thought process of, hey, you have to be part of the big party, the correct party, or if I think that the main reason what it was for back in the day was so you don't get conquered, right? That's why there's not a lot of people flocking to these independent parties because they're small, right? It's harder to say, well, for one, they can't win. I'm not going to say they can't win. It's much more difficult for them to pull off a win as opposed to the two main parties nowadays. Whereas if they go to war, it's going to be a war between the conservative and the liberal parties, or the Republicans and the Democrats at this point. And whoever wins will be the inevitable conqueror at that point. And I'm not saying this I'm not saying this in a like this is going to be like a kinematic or a physical war. This is just going to be a war of ideology at this point, which it has been for a while, but it's becoming a lot more physical nowadays as people are starting to recognize that there is no. It's very difficult to get people to swing from those hardline Republican or hardline Democratic policies back to a more moderate standpoint,
Mm-hmm.
which is trying to find that kind of middle line. It's like, okay, well, what are we willing to give on this? What are we willing to give on this side to make this a functioning society? So
Right.
what does that turn into then? It's like, are we going to eventually turn? A lot of people have been talking about a potential civil war in the future, and some people are saying that, hey, this is going to turn into a physical fight. Some people are saying this is going to be just an ideological fight until somebody just gives and capitulates to the other side's ideas. Whereas that's never going to turn into everybody's just going to magically join one party or the other. It's just going to be, hey, we're not going to fight for a while. We're going to reconstitute, rebuild our ideology until we can come back with force. And we saw that kind of with China back in the day, and the communists versus the democratic parties, right? So
Mm-hmm.
it became a thing where the communist ideals started to spread and started to build, and and eventually they took over mainland China, and the democratic peoples fled to Taiwan. So that's where you kind of it's starting to look like something like that's going to happen, but we don't have the benefit of having an island to run off to necessarily to for the losing party. So um, it's a little difficult to talk through, and it's obviously much more expansive than that. But for the sake of time, I'd
Yeah,
say
yeah,
I'd say stick with the polarizing answer. um,
for sure.
yeah,
I think we're a couple earthquakes away from California snapping off, and then maybe
hey,
that's where
maybe there
everybody
is
can.
an island in the future. You never know. You never know.
Oh man, but I'm with you on the polarization. I think that there definitely is that tribal process. I think what you said before about the political parties and your affiliation to those parties. I think there's something worth noting that I think that within the political parties themselves, there is extremist variations of both sides, and it doesn't take too hard or too long or too far to find where those idealistic views are. Where you basically got go full socialist on one side, and some people who are going full fascist on the other side. Like, what are you trying to say? And you made a point about how things kind of split within China and that whole debacle, and you're still seeing that play out to this day. But um, to be a bit more grounded here in America, I think that a majority of the people exist away from those. And that's kind of why I believe that's informing a lot of my belief that full civil discourse won't take place in the form of a physical war. A lot of it is going to be ideological, but then you think about who the leaders of those ideological wars are, because I don't think it's our political candidate. I genuinely don't think that's. If there is a war going on for your mind and the future of the country, it's definitely going to be internally interested and then externally interested as well. Because there are people who understand, and I think that we have this conversation a lot. We always talk about Russia. And they understand how it works, right? In this regard, you want to cut funding to Ukraine, for example. The best thing you can do is convince the population as a whole that it's not worth it, that them doing it is a bad idea and it's a waste of money. So it is in your best interest not to physically go to America and do something about it, but for you to send these messages or you to buy some people off to put some information out there that says, hey, maybe this Ukraine thing, not that good of an idea. Maybe you make some bots that put a bunch of comments up or put a bunch of people's opinions up that says, hey, you know what? Ukraine, not worth it, not worth the time. Maybe you pay some newscast off, some online pundits off. Maybe you put them on the payroll. You give them 400 grand a month to parrot points that you already believe is true. And because their people believe these guys as direct pundits, they also believe that. So what's the result of that? You get a large growing group of people who are very, very discontent and are outspoken against the support of Ukraine. And then they pull funding. That's how you win that. Not by physically fighting against it.
Right.
And I think scarily enough, terrifyingly enough, that's actually happened. I think that's totally something that's really happening. But I do believe that's a part of it as well. I think that your tie into like the Communist versus the Democratic Party in China is very interesting, because you look at history, you see these ideological divides happen, and these people who are more in line with extreme views, what do they do to the people who don't agree with them anymore? What happens in China right now if you don't agree with the way that people currently? You get re-educated, right? Or even more or worse in the past, you die. They kill people who don't agree with the things that they have to say about what's going on, about what's happening, what they believe in. So I don't, are we headed in that direction? Potentially. I think that the elephant in the room is obvious to me, anyway. Why I think that this candidacy, presidential election, is unique, and it is 100% Donald Trump. I think that what Donald Trump is and what Donald Trump stands for is unprecedented in the political space. And I think that has a lot to do with his success. And I do think it has a lot to do with the concern around the threat of democracy as a whole when it comes to the things that he's or what's happening. It's like, this guy is a convicted felon, right? How is it even remotely possible this guy is winning popular votes? Well, there's nothing that says it can't run, because who would have thought that people would even put somebody up here on the ballot? Nobody's going to vote for this guy, right? It's happening, right? It's a real celebrity type situation, but more worse than that is this is an individual who has come through in the political space, says, these are the things that I need, and I need people that support me. And if you don't support me, I'm going to try to undo you. And that's what we've seen happen. I mean, I've not seen this, not that I was paying attention, but even from what I've read or what I've been learning recently, I've not seen this happen in history before. There's a very sensational appeal to President-elect Donald Trump. I can't deny that. And it's not necessarily that it feels like this celebrity popular party, because like I mentioned before, a lot of Republican talking points, they don't necessarily even have to run on policy. They could talk about the way things were and about the way how things feel. And if other people don't, if us as a generation or population don't hold these people to truth, doesn't matter what side you're on, but specifically when this rhetoric comes out, then they're going to run away with it and people are going to believe it. And you don't get those people back. So I think that there's been no political candidate like President-elect Donald Trump. I really don't. And I think that's a lot of why it's so unique. I think it's why people are liking MAGA to a cult. They're considering it akin to a cult. And something you said very earlier is really a little bit earlier is really standing out to me now, that in order to avoid this trap, everything or every claim that you make about the other party or about something you don't agree with, or even in general, you need to tie it to a fact. You need to tie it to a statistic, tie it to a policy, so that you can show the other person that you're rooted in reality, and so that you can show yourself that you're rooted in reality. If you're saying something that you believe to be true and there is no fact associated to it, how do you know that it's true? How do you know it's not just a feeling you have? How do you know they're not just vibe? You know what I mean? And I think that we're not doing that enough. I think that both parties not maybe necessarily not doing that enough, but I think we're guilty of that overall, and that's the problem that you're seeing now with these newscasters, these pundits that aren't being held accountable for what it is they're saying. They're not rooting, and it's easier for either party to write the other party off as crazy or Trump derangement syndrome because of that. Like, we need to say, I don't agree with this thing. This is a policy associated to it. These are the reasons why I don't believe that. We need to be able to say it to ourselves, and we need to be able to say it to the person. The real issue, I think, and this has been an overarching, is that we're more divorced from reality now than we've ever been, in my opinion, because we simply cannot discern what the truth is. People, and I've interacted with a lot of people, and I believe this is true. A lot of this is anecdotal. This is what I've seen and from my own experience. But you also see it represented in statistical analysis, where if you ask a bunch of people questions of how many black people do you think live in America? Oh, I think it's like 40%, when they actually go back and they look at the number. And they do this, they show you the statistic that it actually is, and they show you what people guessed that it was. And you can see how divorced from reality people are. Like, they think there's a hell of a lot more trans people out there than there actually. And there's a hell of a lot more people out there getting gender reassignment surgery than there actually is. They think there's more abortions happening. They think that there's more, minorities in certain places at all than there really that they are. But I think it's very interesting. You can see that for yourself. Put it on the screen. I don't have a link to it currently, but I think it's going to show that that's the case. The political discourse, the polarization, the divorcing from reality, and the fact that we have a hyper sensational political candidate is why I think this is unprecedented. There's no time like this, I think, in history than there's ever been today. For all those reasons, yeah.
Right. And do you feel like there is a lot of people that are still like fence sitting, or are there people that is it? Do you think that the general population ascribes to at least a political party, even if they don't necessarily like? Do you think more people ascribe to a specific political party as opposed to being like calling themselves moderate nowadays? And why do you think that is?
I'm inclined to believe that there are not a lot of fence sitters. I personally don't think that there's a lot of people in the middle who are believing, this guy's got some good points, and also that guy got some good points. I think there are people that feel that way, but I think that they are decidedly on one side or another.
Hmm.
And I think that most of the people who don't want to say this are not saying it for fear, shame, and space. I think that's the only thing that's keeping them from saying. I think that due to the nature and how strongly forced the thing is, that people are almost always being put in a position where they're like, well, what do I believe?
Hmm.
And where am I at on this? And it's because of what I said kind of earlier that it's like, well, what policies are you even looking at? What are you considering about? Oh, well, I just feel like when candidate A was in power, that things were better. Or I feel like when candidate B was in power, or we were under Democratic Party A or under Democratic Party B, I feel like things are different, which is what I was telling you earlier. But I think the emotions are really strong and they pull you in one direction or another. I think part of the divisiveness is that there aren't a lot of people in the middle. And I think the people that are in the middle are boring. I think that, not that there's a critique to themselves, but the fact that, they're easily overlooked. I'm certain that they exist, but I think that if you are in the middle, then you are such a person who's inquisitively such that you are seeking information out for yourself. And I think that if you're doing that, then it is obvious who the lesser of two evils is in this sort of situation. because there is something that's more rooted in reality. I would say lesser of two evils because, like you mentioned before, not everybody's great. It's not going to be a utopia if one candidate wins and dystopian chaos if you end up another one. You know what I mean? So yeah, I think people are decided. I think a lot of people in America have made up their minds, and I think that there aren't a lot of fence sitters. And if there are some fence sitters, I'll give it to them that they know that they don't want to be involved in this, or they're voting in the middle. They're voting independent for the most part. I don't think there's a lot of people sitting at home, especially today, that are like, I don't know, I might go to the ballot and I'm not sure. I
Yeah.
saw a commercial not too long ago of like there's a couple that was going to vote, and it looked like one guy was torn, like he was like a hard time making a decision. And then you look down on his ballot and he's like drawing a picture of like the two political parties, like the Sistine Chapel or something crazy like that. Like
Yeah.
I don't think that person exists. I don't think that there's people that are going and voting who are still torn.
Right.
Wait. I know it's a non-zero. I know there are people out there that maybe aren't sure, but I just think it's a very, very, very tiny portion of people. I think it's not
Right.
necessarily negligent, but I don't think it's it's a vast majority of the American population is decided yet.
Right. And I will say that from my perspective, based on what I've been seeing from public, just some of the public articles, as well as some family that have sent me pictures about it, some of the polling locations for the early voting is some of the longest lines they've ever seen. So I will say
Mm-hmm.
that I think although this has been a very divided election cycle, a very divided last decade, I would argue, I think that it has, like, this particular election cycle has drawn out the largest numbers of people that are willing to vote and cast that, say something at this point, because we know, of course, that the popular vote doesn't necessarily matter unless you go so far into the one direction that it's obvious that some one person needs to be selected.
Mm-hmm.
But in some cases it's such a small number, and there's oftentimes some of these votes, like, isn't even half the population, right? So I'm wondering if how much it's going to be skewed this time following the election, following the results coming out, because obviously the polling is never particularly accurate. We always see it, and there's always an issue with it, right? It
Yeah.
tends towards a certain way, but we saw even in 2016 was the biggest, the most obvious one, where everybody, all the newscasters were leaning one direction, and they're like, yeah, this is going to be this is a throwaway election, like, we know how it's going to go. And then as the pundits are like talking through it and like actively watching it and talking through the election, like, as the votes were coming in and getting tallied, we saw people getting upset, getting confused, because they're like, and we weren't expecting this. A lot of those situations where I don't know if it's going to be as obvious this time around, and I think that the popular
Mm-hmm.
vote is going to be not necessarily different, but it's going to be a lot more obvious what the general population is interested in, because of the
Mm-hmm.
numbers of people that are coming out and voting, as opposed to what we've seen in the past. And
Correct.
arguably, I think people are a lot more willing to talk about the candidates that they lean towards nowadays, even though there's a lot of issues that come with people breaking off friendships, and sometimes family relationships, like being able to persist through this political discourse. So
I don't know if that's true. I don't know if people are more. Maybe I'm willing to agree with you that they are more willing to talk about politics. I think you got fewer people in the middle that are just politically agnostic than ever before. And I think that some people know, they feel the importance of the election, but I don't think that we're talking to. I don't think we're actually having conversations between both sides. You're not talking about people that are coming together because they had political discourse. They sat down over dinner and was able to meet, or to like respect each other better because they shared their. I don't. Maybe that is happening. Maybe it's
yeah,
not a very
no,
sensational story, but I'm not saying that that's the case or not. I just don't think that's the case. If people are talking more about it, I think they're talking more about it because they're talking to people they already feel like agree with them. And I remember this feeling back in 2016 and leading up to that election, where it's like, there's no way Trump wins, right? I remember thinking that it's like has to be a joke. Like, how's this even possible? And then like I was shocked when it actually ended up happening. That ended up being the case, that there were so many people that were supporting Donald Trump that just weren't saying it. They didn't know it, or not. Or we didn't know it, or I wasn't aware of it at the. Or the I was surprised by how many people. It wasn't a silent or minority. It was a very silent half, and I know that he lost the popular vote on that. Like he won in the electoral college, but still, it was still relatively close as far as um, the split is a lot closer than it felt like it was. But now I think I'm seeing a lot more people open and vocal about it and about what's happening, what they feel and how they're doing it. And to your point, I think it is you mentioned earlier in the past where it's like there's a rift that took place in your intimate relationship. And I was thinking that these are the spaces where we are the most likely to meet in the middle. If I was with a partner and we had difficult different political opinions, I would think that's the most likely person we could agree to disagree with or find some space in the middle to be, having conversations about. But
Hmm.
maybe that's not so much the case. I'm interested in how many like relationships are ending because of that. But I feel like now you're gonna put that shit on your bio or you're gonna wear it on your sleeves when you meet somebody because you want to be with a partner that already agrees.
Right. And I just looked up the polling data, or not polling data, but the turnout percentage data, just to see like how it's kind of changed over the years. And generally, it's going to be somewhere between like 40 and 50 or I say generally somewhere around 50% is pretty standard. Like that's just the amount of people that are willing to come out and do votes. It
Mm-hmm.
used to be higher than that. It became for a long time. Let's see, between what was it? Between 1840 and 1896, 1900, somewhere around there, it was between 70 and 80% that were coming out and voting every year, which
Wow.
just to say, like that was a lot smaller population, so of course it might have been a little bit simpler at that point. But over since then, it's just kind of the average has kind of progressed lower over that time period. But we're starting to see a spike again, as in the last couple of years, which is very indicative of people just placing a lot more importance on the political atmosphere and getting more involved in the politics, even if they're not necessarily fully versed in the politics. So
Sure.
I think that's obviously its own inherent problem in recognizing who should you really be trusting, like and I've gone back and forth on this a little bit myself, and I'm not saying that I want to take away, everybody's right to vote or anything like that, but I do think that there are issues that sometimes when people vote purely out of like someone told you to vote this way, that's not the right way to vote. That's not how you're supposed to vote. You're allowed to do that 100%. That is the legal that is the legal. You can be completely agnostic to the news. You can live out off the grid, out in the middle of nowhere, not see anything, not hear anything until it comes time for a voting season. Show up on election day, vote for whatever name you want to. You are 100% allowed to do that. But
Mm-hmm.
but that is not an informed vote, and you could have just put in someone to power that obviously has no idea what they're doing.
Right.
And so that's its own inherent issue. But that being said, I think that the more the more of the population that does vote, it's good that we are getting out those voices for where people are under, like we can get a better gauge of like where society is starting to kind of lean towards, if it's starting to lean towards a specific political faction. But in the same way, I think there's also a lot of uninformed people out there that not necessarily don't have any business voting, but really need to start paying closer attention to everything, and by and large not be looking at entertainment or pundit or media or anybody and just listening to what they say about things. You have to do more reading. You have to read into the problem, do some research yourself, so that you understand the full context of the issue that you're voting on at that point. So, and there's a lot of stuff, but choose a couple of policies that you are very focused on, that you would count as your top two, top three, something like that, and dive into it. Dig into what
Yeah.
you're actually looking at before you go to the polls and start and make that decision, right?
Yeah, for sure. I had a question about. I was curious. You don't have to answer this if you don't want to.
Sure.
Which political party do you think is more in line with uninformed voting, or I would say emotional voting in some cases? Which? which party is more likely to have a majority of their voters be, or have more voters than the other be uninformed?
It's really difficult because I would argue I would align that with the general news media. So like the where a majority of the media kind of lies, because there's a lot more options for I guess Democratic media as opposed to Republican media, if that makes sense. So when it comes to newscasting specifically, um,
Sure.
there's only one or two that you would really attribute to, you know, conservative values, whereas there's several that you could contribute to liberal values or progressive values. And then there's a couple that you could also attribute to, I guess, more moderate, but at the same time, they still lean one way or another on on some policies, if that makes sense, or some issues.
Naturally, yeah.
So, and then that's where the difficulty is, and that's where we kind of saw with the recent talks about how Jeff Bezos, owner of Washington Post, said they're not going to endorse any
Right.
political party. So we're starting to see where a lot of the people that work there are getting upset because they won't endorse a specific candidate. But at the same time, we're starting to recognize that a lot of people, I think it really falls fairly in the middle because of that decision making. Because generally, Jeff Bezos has been very liberal leaning or very progressive leaning. Whereas this year he's like, okay, if we do that, it's looking like it's going to hurt our bottom dollar, which we are a company. So in that case, I'm starting to see how it could lean either way at this point. So I think it is fairly central, at least at the moment.
I think both parties are equally uninformed, you think?
I think so. Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. That's very fair. I think maybe not being akin to one way or another without some sort of fact, you may be potentially being biased. So it's difficult to answer. I appreciate your answer. And I think some of the things you said that were pretty insightful too. It's like you have to wonder in some case too how much of this is extrinsically motivated, right? Because you've had people who are out publicly bashing Trump, for example. I'm talking about Elon Musk specifically in the past, who was laughing at Trump, saying that, he's not going to last another 4 years. He's too old for this. There's no way he's doing this. To going on stage next to him, jumping up in the air, uh, and fully endorsing this person. And it's like, if he does, if Trump does win, then what do you think? Like Tesla runs mostly or survives mostly off of their government subsidies, and that comes in the form of, hey, we're people, as the population is paying for that in taxes. You see where that money is going and what they're doing. You can look into that yourself and make your own decision, but you can't ignore the connection. So, what are the chances that there are people out there that are like, look, man, financially, you're going to get ruined if you endorse a candidate? And there's been people, and Trump has been very vindictive. I'm not trying to single out Trump, but I just don't see this happen on the other side. But he's the only one doing it. Trump's been very vindictive when people are showing their support for the opposite candidate party. It's like, what was that? Was it Taylor Swift? Taylor Swift came out with the Kamala endorsement, and it was like, no, dude, that's that we don't like. Come on, like
That's not
crazy,
your
right?
place. Yeah, and I will say that yes, we have it has been a lot more I guess broadcasted whenever something then President Trump was a little more vindictive in his decision making for some things, but also even over the past 4 years, we've seen that just as that was happening. Uh, you know that the oh crap sorry was it back in 2016 no sorry it was near around 2020, so when the newest I guess the current administration took power, we saw that a lot of the government subsidies to individuals changed as well. We saw that whenever a lot of so you know that there is a federal tax credit for buying an electric vehicle.
Correct.
Right.
Yes.
It's about $7,500 that you get back on your taxes if you buy an electric vehicle for every company except for Tesla.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I say every company that sells here except for Tesla, not including Chinese companies, as far as I know. There might be some, but I don't know for sure. But that being said, like there is still policy that is written that is not outright talked about by the current administration or previous administrations that they have made decisions on, but they have not gone and said, but they have not advertised it. They're not saying, hey, we're not giving this to Tesla specifically, or we're not giving it to this company because of reasons. They're just saying,
Correct. Yeah.
hey, that this is the change that we're making. And sometimes the excuse is going to be something along the lines of, they're already doing really well on their own. People are buying it anyways. They don't need more money. They don't need subsidies and stuff like that. Which that's kind of the point of subsidies, but if it's only targeting one company whenever you're doing when you're providing these for multiple others, it looks a certain way. And I'm pretty commonly ascribed to, if it looks like a duck, quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck. So it's one of those situations where we don't know the full motivations behind a lot of these political decisions, but a lot of people joke about all the time the military-industrial complex and how the government kind of changes its, or like refocuses its, or refocuses, revectors the money that it's sending to these companies to develop certain technologies to counter other adversaries in the world.
Okay.
So
Hmm.
if we're gonna joke about that, we can't just talk about the military-industrial complex. We got to talk about just the economic complex as a whole. So.
Yeah, period. And I think that a lot of those things have one thing in common, and that's foreign interests, right? Like
Mhm.
we're looking at where some of these things are coming from, who are the major players in this space, and we don't need one company making a majority of the electric vehicles. We would want a market where there are multiple companies that can do that. And it is
Exactly.
another part of the government's responsibility to some extent to break up monopolistic behavior, despite the fact that there are subsidies going. And it's not going just to Tesla to make electric vehicles, it's for SpaceX and all these other projects that are supposed to be revolutionizing science to some
Mhm.
capacity and some extent. I think that you have to be careful, specifically when it comes to interpretation of statistics with expressions like if it walks like a duck, it talks like a duck, because we may not even be understanding what that image even is. If it walks like a duck and it talks like a duck, it could actually be something we've never seen before that looks like a duck. Would you even call that a duck? What's the point in making that decision? But also, I'm pressing X to doubt on that, like, we don't understand or we don't know why the government is making these decisions, because isn't there a level of blatant transparency that has to be done when they're making these sorts of changes? They don't have to offer a direct explanation for why it is that they don't do things. Those documents are infinitely long, but when they are making decisions to support or to give funds, or they do report on that, right? Like there is a documented reason why that happens. Or am I misunderstanding how that works? Because it would make sense
Uh,
to me if you have one company that is already pioneering an electric vehicle space, that they are now like, we don't need to give them a credit for buying this Tesla. Is it for the individual? We're trying to stimulate innovation through competition, and which is what the government does. It's the government job to break up monopolies to ensure that fair trade and equal opportunities being presented amongst the places, specifically when it comes to breakthrough technologies like electric vehicles or with AI, for example. Like,
right.
and usually
Well,
the government is really slow to react to that. Yeah.
right, but a lot of times for the most part, the budget is transparent, I would say, particularly
Okay.
when it comes to subsidies like that. However, there are some things that you can look this up. This is all information that is, public knowledge. That very easy to find, but there's different levels of classified information. There's secret level, there's top secret, and then there's obviously stuff that's above that not everybody is probably privy to. So there's some things that they do, and if it's classified, that's not going to be transparent to the public. If the association of what they're trying to do with that, whatever the operation or the mission or the objective of with those subsidies, wherever that's going, if it's a classified uh, reason, then they're not going to display that to the public until it is not damaging to the government anymore. And that
Sure.
also falls into where black budgets fall, which that falls into where that is something they do not disclose whatsoever, because oftentimes those projects are specific to whatever type of advantage they're trying to get, even to the point where even with classified access, somebody would not be able to have that access to go and look at that unless they are what they call need to know about that specific project. So, and in
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
case, it's very limited numbers of even Congress that are going to have access to that information. So, you run into some issues with the transparency like that, and typically the black budgets aren't I don't, and I would hope that black budgets don't fall into those specific situations where it's providing certain subsidies to certain companies to expand faster or whatever it ends up being. I'm hoping that that wouldn't fall into one of those transparency issues, but there's
Right.
obviously, there's the possibility that some money gets pushed somewhere that, with the interest of giving us a competitive advantage over another country, that we wouldn't be privy to as a
Do you
public.
do you think that's what's happening with specifically in this Tesla case? Do you think that
No, no, no,
that
no, 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 not at all. I'm
oh,
just
okay.
saying that there's a possibility that outside of that, that there have been policies and decisions made with
Okay.
the interest of not disclosing the interest or the amount of money that was given in the interest of gaining an advantage over certain markets. So
Makes sense. That makes
yeah.
and then when we're talking about certain markets, there's like we talked a few times that we've been talking about other countries, chiefly China and Russia. And when we're talking about how unique this election is, I think that we're not the only ones that probably think that that's the case. But we're aware of, to some extent, what's happening in America. And you know, I have spent some time in some international spaces talking to people from other countries. Not a lot, um, but maybe you've got more insight on this than I do. But what are you seeing like internationally as far as the reaction is to this election? Because there's lots of responses to what people are doing. There's obviously concerns about what the geopolitical space will transform
Hmm.
if there is a change of power. What do you think? Or what are you seeing? We're looking at countries like Russia. We're looking at countries like China. Obviously, ones like Ukraine and Israel, but even in some cases, South America and then the world as a whole, as people are looking to see what's going to happen next.
Yeah. So generally, it's still a very like there's a lot of interest in the U.S. election globally. You see that across multiple news networks where they talk about it as just constantly. So I was sitting in my office the other day, and we had the one of the TVs tuned to BBC because we're constantly watching the news in case some emergency happens, and BBC is one of those that are pretty good at like getting the information quickly and talking about it real quick. So it's good for like emergency situations. Like, hey, we need to start looking into this to see if something happened, right? In case like launches like against Iran and stuff like that, right?
Yeah,
Uh, so what came up on one of the like during one of the downtimes was they were talking specifically about the U.S. election, and I was like, oh, that's really interesting. I know that Great Britain has an interest in our election, but then I started like jumping back into my work or whatever, and about half an hour later, I looked back up to double check to see if anything was happening, and still they're talking about the election. So they talk about it for an extended period of time, and there are definitely leanings with those with the caster or the media personnel on or the reporters on the those channels on those broadcasting agencies. But a lot of the people they talk to, they lean very like both ways. There's some people that's like, I can't believe that anybody would even consider voting for Donald Trump. And there's other people that are just like, yeah, Trump all the way or whatever. And it's like it's a very different, atmosphere from both sides. There's some people that are just like, a lot. One of the very common themes was more like I can't believe anybody would vote. So whenever they're talking about it, it's very often, I can't believe anybody would vote for Donald Trump. Or there's some people, yeah, Trump all the way. Well, notice the similar theme there is that neither of them are talking about the other candidate. It's they're only talking about Trump. It's just
yeah,
he is the
Trump or not
focus of
Trump. Yeah,
exactly. He's the focus of the election. And something we're seeing in something that came across a Facebook page that I was like seen several pictures of it from different days is we talked briefly about it earlier is that over in Japan, some of the people are standing outside U.S. military or coalition bases, and they're holding up Trump flags and like saying, "Yeah, vote for Trump" or whatever. And these are international citizens saying that that's who they're supporting, which is not normal for what we've seen in previous elections. It's very unheard of. Like prior to, at least as far as I go back and look at. Um, with other countries, we're seeing similar things, not necessarily something as overt as that situation, but we're seeing, quiet, talks about it's like, okay, how are we going to navigate this if Trump wins, if Kamala wins? How are they going to support us? What are we going to do to convince them to, send us foreign aid and stuff like that, right? So it's
Right,
a it's
right.
a it's a very complicated process, and of course, one of the big interests is maintaining the U.S. dollar's international supremacy in a sense, to make sure that we maintain not necessarily an economic power over the world, but we have kind of a hand. We maintain a handhold in a lot of the trade that goes around the world because everybody trusts in the U.S. dollar. So what we've been seeing
Correct.
over the past 4 years or so is the decrease, especially from COVID, and it's not necessarily a non-interest in the U.S. dollar specifically, but a lot of it has to do with a distrust in funding overall, especially when it's backed by something that's not a that's not easy. I'm not going to say not easy to get a hold of, but it's backed by something that most people don't really deal with on a day-to-day basis. So that's why how a lot of these cryptocurrencies started coming out. It's like these are non-fungible assets. This is something that it's backed solely on at the international interest of the item, which a lot of times that's what a lot of these currencies are nowadays because they're not backed by something like gold or silver or something that is more that we would typically expect it to be backed by, but U.S. dollar is backed by oil because that's an international currency right now. But as the globe continues to kind of shift its focus towards other economic focus or other economic interests, like all electric, like when we're talking about like all electric vehicles or solar power and stuff like that, we see how other countries who have already kind of shifted their focus are getting more value and trust in their currency. So China, for instance, a lot of their vehicle sales, a lot of their industry growing recently has been focused on electric vehicles and electric power because they import almost all of their oil. They don't get it they don't have any internal use of that. So they will not have the economic power when it comes to the oil trade until they get a better hand in the Middle East because that's where a majority of it comes from right now, of course.
Right.
This all kind of harkens back to, where is the trust going? And generally, the trust typically goes back to Team America World Police. But is that going to change over the next couple of decades as the global situation changes? Like specifically when we talk about, and it's getting a little off topic, but kind of it still harkens back to decisions being made in the U.S. It's affecting our international standing. The pullout in Afghanistan and how that got handled. There's a level of distrust. It's like, okay, well, you abandoned your international partners, and now they're dealing with the Taliban taking over their country and essentially, to a degree, enslaving the women again. To the point.
Do people actually believe that? Because to my understanding, it seemed pretty common knowledge, or at least commonly understood on a higher level, that the America's involvement in there, the Taliban was always pervasive, and it wasn't like a hey, like we're gonna abandon, like you guys are here on your own. Like the goal was for the Iranian military was to be able to take care of the things when they left. But these people are actually working with the Taliban
the
to some
Afghani
extent. So,
the Afghani
yeah, they,
military, but yes, the intent was to train them enough that they could handle their own security situation. But although a lot of uh, a lot of individuals that were higher up in the military within the Department of Defense specifically all agreed that no, this is like they're not prepared to do this yet because a lot of the times what would happen is the Taliban were less careful. They're less cautious or about their own lives because they're just like we're ready to fight and die for Allah, right? But the Afghani military, it's like okay, well I'm here to get a paycheck to take care of my family. I'm not going to die for this. So
it's not worth it. Yeah,
they would
yeah.
break ranks and run and wouldn't maintain the security of the country the way that they needed to, and they didn't have the support from us to continue that fight against the ideology of the Taliban that was there. So now
Right.
we've seen that the Taliban has relatively taken over the government there and
Mm,
instituted a lot of a lot of laws harkening back to Sharia, but
Sharia,
they're
right?
not
Exactly.
quite full Sharia yet. So
But the thing is, like, the discourse is that, like, we abandoned them when it was like we did what we said that we would do, and we left them actually aware of what the situation was like. And immediately after we left, the military just turned over control to um um God, why am I drawing a blank?
Taliban, yeah.
Yes, the Taliban. Thank you so much. They immediately turned into the Taliban. So it's like, are people actually really looking at that and saying, like, you guys abandoned these people after the support, or how it happened? Is that the actual geopolitical view? Is that what the international landscape thinks?
Some people are thinking that, and there's some people, and the main idea it goes back to the situation and what it and how we left. It was just so sudden. It was just like they were informed, hey, we're leaving tomorrow, all of a sudden, and then they got on the everybody got on the jets and left. If we hadn't, then why did we leave all this equipment there? Some of the equipment definitely not a big deal. We can leave it behind. It's not going to be a huge impact to us. But why would we just leave equipment behind like that? Particularly some of the advanced equipment that we left, which would include armored vehicles uh, and helicopters and like high dollar expensive items, and it's just the quickness of how we turned around and left just like that, and just had to essentially evacuated to the point where we saw people hanging. Like, I don't know if you've seen the videos, but
Yeah,
uh,
hanging off the bottom. Wasn't that people that were trying to leave the country? They were trying to flee. They were
they
hanging on the bottom.
yeah, they
Yeah,
were
yeah. I'm
hanging
just
off
talking about
the wheel well
the
essentially
wheel well.
of the
Yeah,
C-17, and it took off, and you saw obviously bodies falling because they couldn't hang
and
on.
people froze to death up there too,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
Yeah.
So it's one of those. It's just a very it was a very bad look for like in the method at which we left. And obviously there's more information at other levels that we may not be privy to that talks about that. But the overall look at it, even from some people that were a part of that stepping out, was that it wasn't handled in a responsible way. Let's put it that way.
Mm, okay, that makes sense. I do too. Like, I hear what you're saying about the purpose and focus of the strength of the American dollar in a geopolitical sense, and why people are looking at it to see what's next. There's a couple questions associated with that, but I wanted to talk a little bit too more about BRICS. You heard about BRICS? You know what BRICS is, right?
Yeah,
Right.
very
And
very
they're
informed, in fact.
yes. So yeah, I know you know what I'm talking about. This is targeting like they're trying to build their own kind of currency to rival the U.S. dollar
Hmm.
for all the reasons that you mentioned before. There needs to be some sort of socioeconomic consistency between these countries, and to remove reliance on the U.S. dollar as this principal trading mecca, so to speak.
Hmm.
Um, and for people, I guess, who don't know, right? BRICS is an intergovernmental organization. It's Brazil, Russia, India, China, um, South Africa, Iran, Egypt, Ethiopia. I don't know if
A
I'm
lot of
getting
people.
everybody.
It's a lot of people.
Yeah, there's a lot of people.
The original was five primary partners, and then a bunch of people like are trying to join, and some people have joined already. So
Okay, yeah, and there's a lot of prospects where they're trying to add more people into BRICS doesn't exist yet. But I know a little bit about it. Like India's a part of it, but India's trying to play both sides. They have best
hmm.
and both landscape, et cetera, et cetera. But like you were saying before, it's like these people who are getting their oil, they're relying on their oil. They're getting sanctioned by the U.S. because they're doing things that ain't just fair. They're trying to build their own currency outside of it. So I think they want this to exist and they want this to be a thing. Um, my question is, these are people, these countries that are in BRICS appear to have support for President elect Trump. That's correct, right? Like Russia and China feel like their vested interests are if Trump is in power. That's correct, right?
Some members yes, some members no. It just depends on what their individual interests are. So India, for one, is interested in they're interested in both sides, but they're interested very much in the business prospect of things. They just want to see what is going to benefit them the best on the economic standpoint, because India is a difficult, a fairly broke country when it comes to the general population, right? So they are. Um, you would consider them broke if you compared them to the average family in America, put it that way. So, uh,
Okay.
it's one of those situations where some of them think that they can gain advantage with U.S. currency, and some think that they can gain an advantage with the BRICS currency, which, by the way, BRICS currency that they're trying to build is backed by a gold standard as opposed to an oil
Gold. Yep.
standard. So I think that's also a very important aspect of what we're talking about here. And the difficulty there, of course, is that there's a finite amount of gold in the world, right? So the value of it is going to be obviously backed by a certain amount, but does everybody have the amount of gold in their reserve that can support that? That's the big question. That's the
It's
very
also why they're buying a lot of gold, and the price of gold has been increasing
So,
very well. It's
and
doing better. Gold's doing better than they're doing better than Nvidia right now. Gold's huge.
yeah, it's massive, and I wish I even had enough money to invest in gold a little while back, but I've been throwing some money into silver because I'm like, yeah, that's the next best thing, right?
Yeah, I'm gonna go precious metal, but is it specifically gold? Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, but so that's the difficulty nowadays is some of them are interested in that and recognize the value of the U.S. currency, and some recognize the value of having a U.S. and what some people are calling kind of like a parallel economy. There's a lot of talks of the parallel economy here in the U.S., but they're not talking about what it is on like a global scale. The U.S. dollar versus another large currency, which some people are saying it's going to be the Chinese.
Renminbi.
Thank you. Uh, or the Russian ruble or this BRICS currency. So it just kind of comes down to what is everybody going to or what is going to hold stronger for longer. So like if they continue to build up this currency, this capability or this functionality of this currency, and it ends up failing within a decade or two, the U.S. dollar in theory is going to hold up during that time. Or is it? And will it fail? And is that the reason why they're building up this currency? Because they're anticipating the U.S. dollar will fail. And that's where we're starting to like kind of from people that I've talked to, and from some podcasts that I've watched, and some videos that are just interesting to me. It, you see some of these like very rich individuals building up these compounds and underground bunkers and stuff, like preparing
Yeah.
for something that they know about that we don't necessarily. And maybe it's just the same kind of reason why I want to build a bunker or something, just for the sake of what if if something happens, do I have some place I can retreat to that is more secure than my current home, that kind of thing. But that's beside the point. It's more of another discussion that also would be interesting to have, but for the sake of this, leading back to the politics,
Right.
it's a
Right.
difficult it's difficult to anticipate or forecast what is going to happen with the global economy.
Right. And I just wanted to bring it back to the question because it wasn't necessarily about BRICS as a whole, but like it's India is like maybe an outlier in this regard, but definitely like Russia and China, which are big components to this BRIC, they are pro candidate elect Trump, president elect, right?
I think they're fighting against both. I think they really are.
Like internally, you think it's both?
Yeah, and part of that is so in a way they are supporting it because from my understanding, Trump wants to stop sending so much money to Ukraine. He wants to solve the situation right now so that there's no more war. And that solution that he is that and I don't know this 100% for sure. I just
Yeah,
hear
you
him
have to
mentioning this.
extrapolate because
Yeah,
he's not saying it.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So something that was mentioned previously is that he might be interested in talking with or basically coming to an agreement like, hey, Putin, what you've already accomplished is done. We're going to stop there. If you continue, then NATO's going to go to war with you. But at that point, the follow up is like, hey, you get to keep what you already got, but that's it. We're stopping this now, or you're going to war with the world. That's one of the theories that's been out and about right now. And obviously that's a pretty big escalation, but also Putin doesn't want to go to war with the world. But at the same time, with what he's already accomplished, he'd probably be content with that because the whole goal of Russia at this point is to create a bigger buffer zone between Russia and NATO. So
Yeah.
um, with China, that's a little bit more difficult. Because China's very self-interested with everything that they're doing. They don't really care about anybody else. They just want to be left alone. They do care with the extent or to the extent of they understand that at some point they will grow to a point where they will not be able to continue to colonize China, and they want to be able to colonize outwards because they know they're going to need more land. And that's why we're starting to see some of what's going on in like the South China Sea and over elsewhere where they're trying to, well, for Taiwan, trying to capture part of Taiwan, but that's also just kind of a buffer between where if the U.S. went to war with China, they would have something like out in the way where they could station stuff to keep us further away from mainland China, right? But out in the South China Sea, they're starting to build up sandbars and cays to expand their reach out there. Not necessarily for like residential or purposes, but so that they just have more military control of the region, if that makes sense.
Right.
So,
They too, right? They're doing like more military bases globally, like
mhm,
and especially in Africa and some South American. I don't know specifically where, but I've read. I think that they're putting some more influences and bases out that direction. Yeah,
yep.
that's a
So
part of the same.
yeah, yeah. So in Djibouti, Africa, they do have a permanent naval base out there that also has an airstrip, so it's an air base as well, and it has some of their like armed forces, like ground armed forces, so like their army that are stationed out there. And the interest is kind of similar to the conveyed interest has been towards being able to perform some of that policing operation in the region to protect the ships that are flowing through that area because
Correct.
their big ideas like they want to build a new trade economy that focuses on them being kind of the central part of the world. Like they want to be the middleman for every bit of trade that goes on in the world, essentially, and they want to control
Hmm.
all that so that they can control the profits, essentially. So uh, in doing so, they have to be able to police it. So to police it, they need bases around the world, similar to the way that the U.S. does it
The U.S. does things.
in their
Yep.
coalitions and partnerships. So
It's actually just kind of convenient how that's their ambition to secure those routes. When a vote for President-elect Donald Trump, he's saying that we need to pull away from foreign interests. I think I don't know. I say that he's saying that, but maybe I'm wrong or misquoting or misunderstanding. But my understanding of the conservative opinion is that America doesn't need anybody else, and we need to bring everything back home, get out of those other countries, and kind of withdraw from the geopolitical scene. Which, in that regard, would be a mistake, right? Because we're not able to play in the position of a world police to some extent. Then who's going to do it in our absence? And
right,
you already know that there are people who are interested in doing that, like
right.
China, for example. So,
Well,
um,
and in this case, the way that we're trying to, I believe the way that it's been expressed to me is that his interest is in taking back some of the money that we are pushing to some of these other countries, like. There's some money that's going to Iraq and was going to Afghanistan. I don't know if it still is. I'd have to go back to look at it. But it's going for gender studies in the country, which I have high doubts that that is what it's actually being used for, but that's what it's earmarked for, right? So money that's being flowed
uh,
to that region. But aside from that, it's we're paying a much larger share of the overall percentage of not overall, but not the total percentage, but we are paying a bigger share than most of the other than almost I think might be all of the other countries that are part of NATO in the interest of defending Europe as well in the case of Russia trying to expand further. So
gotcha.
that's where a lot of his rhetoric has what came from the first election cycle at least.
I remember hearing that. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's kind of more where it's for. Yes, I agree that it's not super clear about what his interests are in some of these other like policing and security missions around the world, but he also recognizes that his interest is in leaving these regions responsibly. So at least that's the way that he's conveyed it. And I think that in that case, he was referring back to the Afghanistan situation and making sure that, hey, we do want to leave these areas, but we also want to do it in a way that doesn't leave them with their pants down, basically. Um,
Right.
so yeah,
Cool. Yeah, I haven't heard or read anything that's talking about that or that extent. And I know that's been very nebulous. The concepts of a plan, I guess, is the meme that's been floating around about that. But
yeah,
it's very interesting to see that whatever our role is in current politics, um, what may happen in these spaces should one presidential elect or an incumbent take over, and what the interests and what the ramifications are for the rest of the world may be, or what they seem like. It's hard to believe. It's hard to really know what's happening, like, and what the significance of those things are. But some of them don't look good. Like,
hmm,
it doesn't seem like something that we want to be investing our time or money or attention towards. And that to me feels more like a red herring than it does anything else.
for
Um,
sure.
no, I think that some important discussions, and without like disclosing exactly who it is, who we support or whatever, one way or another, I think it's pretty obvious that these sorts of ramifications for the election are significant. We probably should be talking about that as well, as it represents what's happening to the people, what's happening to individuals, and what's happening to society, and what our role is across the world. So I think it's a good discussion. I don't know if there's anything else that you want to touch on or talk about, or if you just want to go to closing remarks.
No, I mean I'm good with going to closing remarks. My big takeaway from all this is I already said it once, but do your research. Like look into stuff before you go vote. I would highly recommend it. You're again free to do whatever you want, but I hope that everybody stays safe during this election cycle. I hope none of you are interested in committing any violence against anybody else based on their preferences or where they're voting, of course. But outside of that, hope everybody stays safe. Everybody's got a plan in case something terrible happens. But let's we'll see what happens, right? So
Oh yeah, and kind of here on this end, I think that this is a really unprecedented time. I think now more than ever we're divorced from reality in a way that I think is very startling. I think uh, we are looking at a situation where potentially our democracy and what it is we stand for has a chance to be undermined. And if you aren't able to discern that, the ability to discern for yourself is absolutely critical, which means that you need to understand the opposing argument, and you also need to know what it takes for you to change your mind about what it is that you're experiencing. If you don't know those two things, and you have no way of knowing if you're the one that's being manipulated or not, um, wolves in sheep clothing are telling you what you think you need to do. And if you are just willing to go with the opposite of what somebody else says, you're just as easily controlled. So it seems very crazy. It seems a little bit more conspiratorial, but I actually believe if you look at the evidence that's being presented, it's like the proven interference that from other countries, the vested interest that some of these other countries have. You look around, there's evidence of this that you can trace and that you can see. And I would implore you do that. If you're not willing to do that, and I understand that maybe the case, just be aware, have a healthy skepticism of what it is that you're receiving. Even information from us, we're talking about things that are happening, statistics, stories, all that. Look that stuff up yourself. Find the stories yourself. I know we're doing it easy for you by putting links and stuff down in the description below. We're pulling from a lot of different sources that we've seen and that we've heard. Maybe some of them aren't credible. Maybe some of them are credible. But I would like to believe that sources are credible. Become an agent, not necessarily of the truth, but you can do this in such a way where you don't need to isolate or alienate other people. These are your fellow Americans. These are your brothers and sisters. These are people that that don't want you guys don't want to see harm to one another. And we need to do a better job of being receptive to other opinions and listening to what the other person has to say. Don't be afraid to be in the middle, and don't be afraid to stand up for what you believe in a way that doesn't disrespect what it means to be in the same country or nation, what it means to share the same human experience as somebody else. I think that's absolutely critical. Yeah, but that's it. That's it for us today. That's great. I appreciate the discussion as always.
yep.
Always, 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 always good to see and to hear from you and to see your face. Love the mustache. Uh,
Hey
oh
man, you got
man,
the full beard going on now. It's great. I wish I
yeah, I've
could grow.
been.
I wish I could grow it. My boss says no though. Meaning the government tells me no.
Look, one day I'll see you with the full beard. And talk about this day, but thank you
I'm
so
hoping.
much for talking to me. I appreciate you so much.
Absolutely. And just one last thing on what he was saying. I agree 100%. Nobody is wishing any harm on you as a person. Like everybody wants the best for everybody. Everybody just has different ways of what the way that they think that it'll get done. So just understand that that nobody's trying to hurt you. Nobody is intending to hurt you. At least not your regular fellow man. But they are interested in bettering themselves and ideally bettering your life as well. So um, yeah, that's all I've got. In case there's any saved rounds from you.
Nope, you're good.
All
We're
right.
gonna send it off. I love you guys very much. Be
Yep.
well. Be safe. Call your parents.
Have a good one, guys.